My name is Kirby Lockard, and you're watching one of the Design Drawing Videotapes. This is a series of 10 tapes designed to help students of architecture, landscape architecture, and interior design learn how to draw freehand perspective sketches. This particular tape is number 6. It's the third tape in a 3-tape set on shadow casting, and it's especially concerned with lighting interior perspectives or casting shadows in interior perspectives. Like the other videotapes, you're going to need to draw along with me to get any benefit from the tape. You can't just sit and watch television. You're going to have to actually draw with me. And in order to do that, you're going to need a set of Prismacolor pencils. You're going to need a white and a black pencil for drawing sunlight, shade, and shadows. You're going to need a blue, non-photo blue Prismacolor pencil for drawing skies, apple green Prismacolor maybe for drawing landscape, a violet Prismacolor. We're going to need to draw a couple of lines with that. Then you're going to need a red marker with which to draw the casting edges that cast the boundaries of the shadows. And you're going to need a black line making tool that lets you draw long freehand lines comfortably. You're also going to need perhaps a little bit of buff tracing paper, and you're going to need the exercises, blanks, that came along with the videotapes. The first of which looks like this. I would recommend that you take the time to trace it on yellow tracing paper. Turn off the videotape and trace it at this point, because what I'm going to ask you to do is turn it over and put white Prismacolor on the back of the window, the back of what we see through the window. Because interior perspectives are fundamentally different from exterior perspectives in at least 2 different ways. And probably the most basic way is that we are inside the shade-shadow system. We're not looking at it on an object that's separated from us. It's like we were inside the little shadow analysis cube and the shadows are all around us. And that means we're in a sort of closed off, semi-closed off interior space, which is relatively dark. And we're looking out on a very brightly illuminated exterior. That's why we put Prismacolor on the back. And anytime you have a chance to make that distinction, do it. Before you cast shadows or do anything else, simply say, we're in a dark volume and outdoors is a very bright sunlit volume. Please take your sky blue Prismacolor pencil and just touch the sky blue like this, because that will also help communicate that impression. And once we've done that, we're ready to start a sunshade analysis. And we're going to let the sunlight come into the room, which is the only gutsy way to cast shadows on an interior. It's no fun to pretend the sun is behind you and none of it is entering the room and the building's just casting a shadow out in the patio. To even take the time to attempt to draw light in an interior perspective means you've got to let the sunlight come into the room. If you do that, then all the surfaces that face you, the transverse vertical surfaces, will be in shade because they'll be turned away from the direction of the entering sunlight. So you can shade in all those transverse vertical surfaces that are silhouetted against the light. They would include this wall out in the patio. They would include the backs of this mullion pattern, the vertical and horizontal mullions. So those surfaces are going to be in shade. The other surfaces that will always be in shade in an interior perspective are the undersides of things, the ceilings. And they'll probably be the second darkest surface in the room. Be the bottoms of things like ceilings and soffits and anything any horizontal surface that you look up at. Okay, and then we're left with the choice. The only really maybe significant choice, if we're going to let the sun enter the room, is it coming from the right or the left? I would always make it coming from the side that is closest to the near vertical vanishing line, so that the perpendicular shadows cast by transverse horizontal lines will fall over here on this wall where I can see them better, and they'll take up more of the perspective because they're going to be some of the most dramatic angles. Once we've made the sunshade analysis, we need to now identify the casting edges. Wait, after I made that decision, I forgot to tone this in. We tone in this wall surface light gray because it's going to be in shade. And now that our sunshade analysis is complete, we can identify the casting edges. Remember, they are those edges, those outside corners that separate a sunlit surface from a surface that's in shade. And it's those casting edges that are going to cast the boundary of the shadow pattern. Well, first of all, there's a flagpole shadow right here. I'm not going to see the sunlit surface, but I know if I went outside the building, turned around and looked, the face of the building would be in sunlight. And at this corner, it would change from a sunlit face to a shady sidewall, a near vanishing vertical sidewall that's in shade. I'm going to get another shadow caster like that here in the vertical mullion. It's going to cast a shadow, a flagpole shadow. And I'm going to get another one out there at the corner of the wall where the sunlit end of the wall turns a corner and becomes a shade surface. Horizontal casting edges, the transverse horizontal casting edges, I'm going to get one here where the ceiling plane turns upward into a sunlit parapet wall of the building. I'm going to get one out there at the top of the patio wall where the shady back of the wall turns the corner onto the sunlit top of the wall. And I'm going to get one here in this horizontal mullion. Okay, now notice that they come in sets. There are 3 vertical casting edges, there are 3 flagpole casting edges, and there are 3 horizontal, transverse horizontal casting edges. That means that those 2 sets of casting edges will produce 2 sets of perpendicular shadows. Let's start with the flagpole shadow. Let's say that I want the shadow of this vertical casting edge to cast a shadow across the floor of the perspective at this angle. That means that I'll select a vanishing point here for flagpole shadows on the eye level line to which they'll all converge, because they will converge to a single point on the vanishing line for the plane in which they lie. And all horizontal planes vanish into this eye level vanishing line. Let's draw the beginnings of the other 2 flagpole shadows. One of them will be like that on the floor, and one of them will be like that out in the patio, all coming from this flagpole vanishing point. We don't know yet how long they are. But let's try the others. These transverse horizontal casting edges are perpendicular to this near vanishing vertical wall, and so they'll cast perpendicular shadows down across that wall at some angle, and we get to choose it. We get 2 free choices of these perpendicular shadow angles. So I'm going to choose this angle like this and make that shadow come down across the wall like that until it hits the floor. Okay, then the shadow from the mullion will be similar to that. It'll come from the same vanishing point because it's exactly the same spatial condition, and so will the shadow cast by the top of the patio wall. It'll come down like that. Now, when those shadows hit the floor, they run out of perpendicular casting relationship. The line that's casting the shadow is a transverse horizontal line, which all 3 of them are, which are parallel to the floor. So every one of those shadows will change into a parallel shadow when it hits the floor and just come right straight across the floor like that from the near vanishing point. Okay? So this is the shadow cast by that edge of the ceiling, and everything behind it is going to be darkened in shadow. So I'm going to have to hurry so I don't take a lot of videotape time just blackening in shadow. So my little drawing is going to get a little bit sloppy. Your drawing, if you want to make a better drawing, you can take your time, stop the tape, and take a little more care with putting in the shadow. But I won't waste your time or the videotape's time by showing you how neatly I can render a shadow. This will all be black in shadow. Everything further back into the room then is in shadow. And this will all be shadow. And one of the interesting things about shadow casting, and one of the reasons it's my probably very favorite part of drawing, is it's like puzzle solving, but it also looks right when you get it right, because we've been reading, our perception has been reading shadow patterns all our lives, and so when one begins to get correct, our eyes sort of tell us it's right, feels right, looks right. We perceive it as really looking like sunlight would look when it came into the room. And maybe need to heavy that one up a little bit. And now let's deal with the flagpole shadows. I forgot to darken in this one. These 2 will intersect about there. And so I can darken in that shadow out in the patio. And then all I have left is to finish the flagpole shadow cast by the central vertical mullion. And it's going to march across the floor like this. Just keep coming. And it's probably going to intersect the top shadow about there. Okay, now let's take a moment and just understand that. Can you see the set of 3 transverse horizontal casting edges? The fact that they cast this set of perpendicular shadows on the near vanishing vertical wall here. You can see the 3 flagpole shadows and the fact that they cast 3 flagpole shadows on the horizontal floor of the space. And remember that we got to choose both these vanishing points. They were ours to choose freely. Which brings us to the second difference in interior perspectives. And that is that, and here I'm going to pull in our little shadow box, and you may want to take the time to draw that, but I'm just drawing our little shadow analysis cube in the foreground of the perspective. And showing you why we never see the third perpendicular sun angle. So we get to choose both those that we can see, and we never have to deal with that third shadow. This is the reason. If you'll take your black marker, if you've taken the time to draw this little cube, and using those same vanishing points like this vertical corner strut, and remember that the cube has got to face the sunlight, so we're sort of standing behind the cube, and we'll have to draw dotted lines to describe the pattern that would actually be happening on the face of the cube. It'll start across the floor like that, then it'll disappear from our sight, but we know it'll just keep coming like that. This shadow cast by this transverse horizontal strut on this near vanishing vertical sidewall will come from this point. It'll come down like this, and it'll start down like that across the surface, and then it will disappear, but we know it'll just keep coming until it hits the back wall. When it hits the back wall, the line or the strut that's casting the shadow is now parallel to the back wall, so the shadow is a parallel shadow coming across the back wall like that. Now meanwhile, the flagpole shadow on the floor has reached the back wall, and it starts to climb vertically up the back wall until the 2 intersect about there. When we reach that point, we have reached the shadow of this corner of the 3 struts. The only strut left to cast the shadow is this near vanishing horizontal strut. It's perpendicular to this transverse vertical plane, so we know that the shadow will just come right back to the base of the line that casts it. Now that's the perpendicular shadow that we would only see if we walked out into the patio and looked back at the face of the building. We never see it in this interior perspective, so we never have to deal with it. And for that reason, we never have to find a sun's ray, except in perhaps the most rare occasion. And I wanted to show you that we don't need the cube because we're in one. We're in the cube. And if you take your violet pencil and draw a vertical vanishing line for sun's rays like that through the flagpole vanishing point, then you can look down under here and you can see the intersection of this corner, which is the shadow of this corner. And all we would have to do is connect that point. Now, I'm not talking about the little shadow analysis cube. I'm talking about the real perspective underneath here. You see that this is the shadow of that corner? So all we have to do is connect those 2 in our room, in the perspective we're drawing, and continue it until it intersects with this vertical vanishing line for flagpole shadows, and we've found the flagpole vanishing point without even using the cube, because we're inside a shadow cube. And that's the major difference in casting shadows in interior perspectives. Now, I'd like you to go back over this if you've had trouble keeping up or if you've misunderstood. And if you're getting it, stop the tape and see if you can anticipate the next step I'm going to do. And continue to use that technique as we move on to the second perspective, which looks like this and is a little bit more complicated. But we're going to take our time and walk right through it, and I think you'll understand almost all of it the first time through. This perspective is a little more interesting for shadow casting, a little more challenging. The first thing I do is take my blue Prismacolor pencil and color in the sky so that we're reminded what is roofed and what is unroofed. And then remembering what we've always done or what we always can do in interior perspectives is we can take our black Prismacolor pencil and shade in all those surfaces that face us. Because once again we're going to assume that the sun is coming into the space. so that all these transverse vertical surfaces that run across the plane in front of us will be in shade. Now once again, my drawing's going to get a little sloppy because I'm going to have to hurry. If you'd like to make a nicer drawing, you're going to have to stop the videotape and take a little more time than I'm taking. Those vertical riser faces on the stairs or steps will all be in shade because they're turned away from us. And the next surface that we can always put in shade in interior perspective is the ceiling. So we get this last step riser face, and then we're going to get the ceiling. Now try to apply the tone in a consistent way so it looks disciplined. And don't just do it like you were painting a house or something. Make all the strokes in this. It's easier for me, and I think it adds a certain grain or consistency to the drawing if I apply all these tones at 45 degrees from lower left to upper right. For right-handers, that seems physiologically to be one of the most comfortable ways to apply tones. Okay, now we're changing a couple of things in this perspective. We're going to put the sun on the right because remember, I want to see those shadows on the near vanishing vertical planes over here on these walls that I see more nearly at 90 degrees, that are sort of splayed out and lets me draw and see the shadow pattern more directly. So I'm going to make this face in shade, and that means that the sun is coming from the right-hand side and in front of us. And once we've made this sun shade analysis, the next step is to identify all the casting edges. So if you'd like to stop the tape and see if you can do that by yourself, that would be a good test of your learning. If you don't, I'm going to tell you where they are, and you won't get a chance to know whether you could have figured it out by yourself or not. This is the casting edge right here. It's a vertical flagpole casting edge because it separates this shaded interior vertical wall, near vanishing vertical wall, from the sunlit face of the building. If I went out and turned around and looked at the building, I know that around that corner would be sunlight. This is also one of those vertical flagpole casting edges because I know the end of that wall is going to be sunlit. And then I have a whole set of casting edges like this, transverse horizontal lines, in this case separating the sunlit top of the wall from the shady back. And I have that exact same condition here, only here I actually see the sunlit surface, and here, and here. And I have one more, which is, and I'll always have this one, at the end of the ceiling, where the ceiling turns up and becomes the sunlit parapet wall of the building, or fascia, whatever's out there. Okay. As in the other perspective we did, I now get some choices. I now get to choose the angle of the flagpole shadows. They're going to come across the floor like this, somehow, from some vanishing point along this eye-level vanishing line. And I'm going to get to choose the angle of these shadows, which are going to come down across that near vanishing vertical plane at some angle from a point on this near vertical vanishing line. So I'm going to make this choice first. I'm going to say I want this shadow, which is the major shadow in the whole perspective, to come right down across that wall at that angle. And it will just come straight on down until it hits that level raised portion of the floor or seat or whatever you want to think of that as. Now let's get the rest of the members of that set. There's going to be one here, cast by the top of the patio wall. There's going to be one here at the end of this little step like that. There's going to be one, whoops, it's going to be more like this, cast by this casting edge on this near vanishing vertical surface. And there's going to be one more down there. Now I hope you can see this as a set of perpendicular shadows cast by similar spatial conditions, by a transverse horizontal casting edge on a near vanishing vertical plane. Okay, let's do the flagpole shadows. Let's say that I want the shadow of this corner back here, this vertical flagpole corner of that wall, to come across like that. I can choose this vanishing point. I get to choose both these. They're my free choices. And remember that they're the only ones I'll have to deal with whenever I put the sun in front of me. I'll never see that third perpendicular shadow angle. Now, when these shadows, this whole set, hits the horizontal surface, the relationship changes because the edge that's casting the shadow is a transverse horizontal line, and that's parallel to the floor, parallel to the horizontal surfaces. So this whole set turns into parallel shadows and comes across the floor as a set of parallel shadows, all coming from the far vanishing point, which we can't reach in this perspective framework, but which we know is slightly converging. Okay, there we go. There's that whole set of lines. And something interesting happens here. This line runs out a horizontal surface. So what happens is that it reverts back to a perpendicular shadow because the line that's casting it is perpendicular to this vertical surface. So it once again will come from that same vanishing point that we established like that. When it hits the bottom floor, the very bottom level, then it turns and comes across the floor like this. Okay, now let's take the time to color in those shadows with your black Prismacolor pencil. And one more time, I'm going to have to hurry so that I don't use up a lot of the valuable videotape time. Remember that shadows are always darker than shade. At least that's a convention we use in casting them. Actually, it might depend on the inherent darkness of the material on which the shadow's falling. But in terms of light, it's considered to be darker because the shade surfaces will have some reflected light in them. Okay, so I have to turn all that dark. And then I have to turn this surface dark. And I have to turn these little guys dark. Now, we should make a difference if we can. We'd have to do a little more detailed analysis than I have time for on the difference between shadows on this vertical surface and shadows on the horizontal surface. I'm going to make the distinction. I'm going to make the shadows on the floor just a little lighter so that they are a little bit different. And that matters mostly right here, where I have to differentiate between two shadow surfaces, the value of two shadow surfaces that intersect at this corner and this corner. I'm going to make the shadow on the vertical wall a little bit darker just to get a distinction between those two surfaces. I have to do the same thing in sunlight, and I'll do it this way. I'm going to make the sunlight on these side walls brighter, whiter, than the sunlight on the floor. And the reason I'm doing that is so that at this point where this sunlit surface, this sunlit vertical surface, turns into a horizontal surface, I can just lightly put white on the horizontal surface. And I need another distinction here. See, it's nice if one of these two surfaces is whiter than the other so that there is a distinction across this little step system here. And once again, this is would be a very light white. Okay, I have one thing left to do, and it's the most complicated thing for understanding in this perspective. I don't think I've really showed you anything new so far, but this is new. Here we're going to cast the shadows on a step system where the sun is in front of us, and the faces, the riser faces of the stairs are in shade. That means that these transverse horizontal casting edges are all going to cast a shadow coming across the system like this. But they're going to be interrupted or intersected by a vertical flagpole casting edge, the shadow of a vertical flagpole casting edge. And it's that one that we have to take just a little time to understand. We know how it starts. It starts right up there, and we can black in that little shadow. And that little perpendicular flagpole shadow is coming from this vanishing point. Now, there are a couple understandings that we can use. One of them is imagine that the steps are gone, and imagine that this casting edge comes all the way down until it would intersect with this floor at this point. It would be the intersection of this wall and the floor if we remove the steps. If that were the case, I think you can see that there would be a flagpole shadow come from the base of that on this lower level, and it would come across like that. So we can pretty much establish where that last shadow is. It's about there. Our problem is, how do we get from there to here? Well, we could do that at each level, but it's easier if we drop a little auxiliary line. I won't show because no shadows show in shade, but we could draw a little light line there, and that would tell us where the shadow started on the next step. It would be like that. Then we could drop a little light line like that, and that would tell us where the shadow started on the next step. It would come out like that, and when we drop the last one, we should get something like agreement, and we do. It should come out about the base of this other shadow. One other way, and probably a simpler way of visualizing this, is as if this red casting edge were a big tree, and you just sawed it down, and you yelled, "Timber!" and it fell in a great arc like this, and it had a knife blade on the front of it, so it cut through the steps, and the cutting pattern that it made on the steps would look like that, okay? That's one way to visualize it. Now, we don't see the shadow. We don't see this within the shade face. Neither do we see this other shadow here. We just see it when it comes out of that other shadow, when it emerges from the shadow that's being cast by the transverse casting edge. So let's shadow this in, and our little perspective should begin to look pretty good, because this is a rather dramatic shadow pattern that we're getting down the steps. And this is one of those perspectives where choice is really important, because I would always want to choose the two shadow angles that I get to choose, which are both of, I get to choose both these vanishing points, remember. And I don't have to deal with the sun's ray. We didn't even have to find it. I can show you how to find it, but we didn't need to. I would want to choose those very carefully so that I got sunlight all the way down to this lowest level. I think that's very important for the looks of this perspective. And I want to take the white pencil and color that just lightly on the lowest level. And I probably ought to add just a little white, particularly at the corners here and maybe up there. Let's take the green pencil and color some just landscape color out there just for fun. And maybe color, lay over a little sort of green leaf mass there. And sharpen up some of our edges, and I think we have a pretty interesting shadow pattern. Now, if I don't like that for any reason, if I don't like this shadow pattern, I can adjust it just by changing these two decisions. One of the reasons for shadow casting the way I am is I have to keep these in the camera frame and on your piece of paper. Some of the more dramatic shadow angles may well emanate from vanishing points that would be off the paper, which I could reach if I had a straight edge or just the ability to put the point there. But I have to confine these within the frame so that you can see them and we can work on them together. Now, take a minute and look at what we did. We made a sunshade analysis. We identified sets of casting edges, 2 vertical casting edges and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 horizontal transverse horizontal casting edges. Probably the most important decision was that angle, because look how many there are. There are this many perpendicular shadows that all come from this vanishing point. So the determination of where that vanishing point is and that angle is supremely important for the success of this little perspective. The other angle that I get to choose is this one, and I want to choose it close enough that it lets the sunlight all the way down. For instance, if I put it over here, this angle would close out this sunlight, and I would never see the sunlight sort of march down those steps, which is one of the most dramatic things about it. Now let me show you how to find a sun's ray, just in case you needed to. Remember that the vertical vanishing line for sun's rays grows out of the flagpole vanishing point. It's a vertical line, always a vertical line, from the flagpole vanishing point. And this is called a vertical vanishing line for sun's rays. And to locate a sun's rays, you simply take a point, which is in the perspective, the shadow of a point, and that point, connect the two, and where they intersect will be a vanishing point for sun's rays. You might need that, you probably won't. We're able to cast the shadows almost entirely with, or we have been so far, with just 2 perpendicular choices, which are both ours to make, and the connecting parallel shadows, staying completely on the architectural surfaces. Looking at this perspective again, I'd like to point out one other thing, and that's the benefits of drawing on buff tracing paper for yourself. not to show a client particularly, but just for your own enjoyment. Particularly in casting sunlight or casting shadows and showing sunlight, I know of no other technique, quick sketch technique, that makes light jump up off the paper like drawing with a white Prismacolor pencil on buff tracing paper, particularly when you mount it on a darker surface like this oak table. It really is alive in a way that would take you a much longer, in fact, you never could do it on white paper, on white opaque paper. Now, if I rushed you a little bit in this shadow casting second perspective, stop the tape, rewind it, and go back over it until you understand it fairly thoroughly, and even try to stop it and anticipate what I'm doing as a test or a demonstration of how much you're learning. And then when you're ready, we'll go on to an even more complicated and I think more interesting perspective that looks like this. And this you should pull out of the material that came with the videotapes, and this is the next perspective on which we'll cast shadows. Just as in the other perspectives, the first thing I do is take the non-photo blue Prismacolor pencil and color in the sky. I think there's a lot to be said for enjoying your drawings as you go along, and this will just begin to make the perspective look better and remind you that there's a blue sky out there and a sunlit space beyond this perspective. It begins to tell us or reinforce what's inside and what's outside in the perspective. The next thing we can do is pick up the black Prismacolor pencil and begin to color in all those surfaces that we know are going to be in shade. And they always begin with the ceiling and those surfaces that are turned away from us. Let's start with the ones that are turned toward us and away from the sun. These are the transverse vertical surfaces. And I'm going to hurry as much as I can without losing the quality, and I have to shade all these in. This is one of those places where you could stop the tape and see if you can anticipate all the shade surfaces in this drawing. And I can tell you ahead of time that we're going to choose the sun coming from our right. So the sun is out in front of us and to our right. And all these surfaces will be in shade, as well as the ceiling. And it'll take a little while to put them in. The ones I'm drawing now would probably be the darkest shade surfaces, because it's going to be hardest for light to hit those, because it'll have to reflect back almost 180 degrees to reach one of these surfaces that's silhouetted against the light. Okay, the backs of the little window seats are also one of those surfaces that's turned away from the light. As is the back of these light shelves or sort of thickened soffits over the window seats. And it's best when you're doing this to still conceive of it as sets of surfaces. Try to get, it's almost like coloring by the numbers. Once you understand that one surface is in shade, you look all over the drawing, you say, how many more of those guys are there? How many more surfaces are there that have that same surface orientation? Now, if I'm counting right, I'm on about the last one of these surfaces that are silhouetted against the entering light. And the next thing I'm going to do are the ceilings. And I'm going to make them not quite so dark. They would maybe get a little more reflected light than these surfaces that turned away. So the soffits over the window seats are going to be in shade. And this lower ceiling is going to be in shade. And of course the upper ceiling is going to be in shade. And then, if I haven't used up all my black Prismacolor pencil, I'm about ready to determine the casting edges. And remember that those edges are outside corners that separate a sunlit surface from a surface that's in shade. And we need to identify even the ones that are hidden, the ones that we don't see, but which very well might cast shadows which we see. So we have to have a kind of a spatial imagination in order to imagine where those hidden casting edges would be. And now we also said the sun was coming from the right, so that this wall will be in shade. And I think there are a whole bunch of sets of casting edges. One of the reasons for this particular perspective exercise is it shows you various kinds of casting edge sets. For instance, here's one that obviously separates a sunlit surface from a shade surface. And the minute we see that that is a casting edge, we can look around the room and find that there's another, and there's another. We can begin to see that that forms a set, and of course these continue on up there. And then there is a hidden casting edge if we walked outside the building and looked back at the sunlit face of the building, we'd find that there's a hidden casting edge out there at which one surface that meets at that corner is sunlit, the face, and the left side will be in shade. So there's one of those up there, and there's one of those there, and there's even one of those about over in there somewhere. Now let's take some horizontal ones. The obvious horizontal ones are here at the nose of the little window seats. There's a set of those. And then there are two here. One there, where the shaded soffit over the window seats turns up into the sunlit face of the building. And one there, where the back shady side of the light shelf rolls over the corner onto a sunlit horizontal surface. And there's a set here, where the shady ceiling ends and turns up into the sunlit face of the building. And there's one of those there. Now, we're forgetting one here, and I think we may have the entire set of casting edges. We're going to ignore for the moment that building in the distance. If we have time, we may put shade and shadows on it, but we're mostly concerned with this space we're in. Now, we're going to get to choose, just as before, we get to choose the two perpendicular shadow angles that will determine the shadow pattern in this room. And I'm going to start by choosing the shadow of this casting edge on this wall, because that's going to be very prominent in the perspective. And and there are a whole bunch like that, so I'm going to find an angle that looks good on this wall and find out where the vanishing point would be for such an angle. And it's going to be about right there. And that angle shadow is going to come down across that wall about like that. So I can draw that in heavily with confidence because that's a free choice. And once I do that, I can look around the perspective and see how many others there are just like that. Well, there's one here. There's another here that are identical spatial conditions. There's also there are some cast down here by the nose of the window seats. There's one there, there's one there, and there's one there. Now there are also a series of shadows like that up here coming through the clear story windows. There's one there, and this presents us with a dilemma that I give this same exercise to my students at the University of Arizona. And it gives me a chance to illustrate what you might call judgment in shadow casting. And I tease the students who may have transferred from engineering, because we have some of those, and I say that this shadow illustrates the difference between an architect's approach to shadow casting and an engineer's. If an engineer were presented with that choice, he would feel it was his moral responsibility, or her moral responsibility, to put on his bifocals, sharpen his pencil, and find out really for sure whether that shadow falls on that upper light shelf or comes on down into the room. An architect wouldn't waste much time with it. He'd probably say, if you think I'm going to let that little sliver of sunlight come down into the room so that I have to chase it up over all the furniture and all the people, you're crazy. I'm going to close it out right there. I'm going to say it falls on that upper shelf because I'm not going to waste my time casting the shadow down into the room and over all the furniture. So you always have to make value judgments, I think, in drawing as to what's worth your time and what isn't. And I think that one wouldn't be worth your time. Now we can cast the other three shadows, the other two shadows up there. And then we have a very dramatic shadow, still a member of this same set, over here. It's going to come down the wall like that until it hits the floor. and then it's going to change into a parallel shadow and come across the floor like that. Okay, now about this time we need to get a kind of an overall picture of what the sunlight's going to do in the room. And one of the ways to do that, and one of the best habits to get into in shadow casting, is to simplify the situation so you kind of see the big picture. One of the ways to do that is I'm going to lay a piece of tracing paper down over mine, and you may or may not need to do this with me. I think you could just watch while I do this one because it's not that complicated. I'm going to eliminate the columns. I'm going to consider that the columns aren't there, and I'm going to see what kind of a shadow pattern would be cast just by the sun that comes through this opening, if I assume that the columns are gone. And I'm going to bring this casting edge all the way down to the floor. And I can see that I've got the start on it because I've got this shadow coming down the wall. The trouble is it runs out of wall. Well, one of the things that you should get in the practice of doing is when that happens, sometimes you need to extend a wall. So we're going to put a handle on that wall, and we're going to slide it just like it was a sliding panel until it gets to at least this position. So here it comes. We just slide it out like a panel. Here's the new position of the handle. And when we do that, we can see that then the shadow could just ride right down the panel to the floor. Just comes right on down. Well, we don't need all this part of the shadow. All we need is this little piece down here where it hits the floor to know where it's going to turn into a parallel shadow because it's being cast by a transverse horizontal line. It'll turn into a parallel shadow on the floor and just come right across the floor like that as a parallel shadow. Now, we need to extend this flagpole shadow all the way down to the ground, and we get to choose this angle. I'm going to choose it as coming from about right there so that it's going to come across the floor like that, and now I can see what the big picture of the sunlight that comes through that opening will be like down this wall and across the floor. So having found that out, I can go back to the perspective now and just draw this shadow on down here, bring it across the floor as a parallel shadow, make my choice over here of a vanishing point for this flagpole shadow and come across the floor like that. Okay, now I can confidently and safely make everything back of that shadow boundary very dark because that's all going to be in shadow. All the rest of the room will be in shadow. I can darken in these. I can darken in these. And if it's working right, the room's beginning to look real. It's beginning to look as if it were lit by the sun coming through those openings. You can darken in these, and these guys all turn into little parallel shadows at the floor and just come across the floor like that, parallel to the edge that's casting them. Well, I have no problem with those. This is going to get a little shadow on the window seat itself, and I need to ask myself, will I see, I know there's going to be a shadow there, will I see it, and will I see that one? Well, it's sort of iffy where I'd see this one or not. I'd have to find the intersection of the window seat, then I'd have to come from there, and I'd probably fudge it out so I saw it, just so there were two of these guys instead of one. This one I know there's no way I'm going to see that shadow from this angle. It'd be there, and if I walked around the corner and peeked, I'm sure it would be there. But I'm just not going to see it from this perspective angle. Now we can also color in all this shadow on the floor. And then we need to take our white pencil and color one of the sunlit surfaces. We don't need to color both of them, and certainly not both of them equally dark, but I'm going to choose to color the ones on the sidewall, on the near vanishing vertical surfaces, white, because I think those are probably the most dramatic shadows in the perspective. And I'd like to call attention to that. I know that we haven't dealt with this shadow running up the steps. If anybody's worried about that, we're going to. We'll take care of that one. But it's a complication that I'd like to put off until I get some more sunlight in the drawing. And then we'll blow it up and understand it completely. Okay. Need to get sunlight on this surface. we need to finish this shadow too that's coming in this opening, and we can do that. We know about where the base of this hidden casting edge would be. We could actually draw the footprint just by going to the near vanishing point of the perspective like that. And then we could come back from it with a flagpole shadow like that, and we can see that it's going to come across the floor about like that, and that all this is going to be in shadow. I would make the shadows on the floor a little lighter than the ones on the sidewall. Well, actually, no, it should be the other way around. The floor shadows should be darker, and the sidewall shadow should be lighter. So I can make the floor shadows almost black. Okay, that means that unless sunlight comes up, these horizontal surfaces of the steps will be darker than the shadows on the vertical surface. Now, don't finish that yet because we're going to blow that up. We need to understand what happens right there. So I'm going to blow up that condition, this area of the perspective right there, because that's worth understanding completely. It's going to look like this. And let's refresh ourselves as to what's happening. First of all, we have a perpendicular shadow coming down across the wall like that, cast by a transverse horizontal casting edge. And we know that on the steps, it's parallel to horizontal surfaces, so it's going to go back here as a parallel shadow, and then revert again to a perpendicular shadow, and it's going to keep doing that pattern up the steps. It'll just keep doing that. What's going to happen, though, is that it's probably going to get interrupted by the shadow cast by this vertical casting edge on the steps. Now, this vertical casting edge starts across here as a flagpole shadow, coming from the flagpole vanishing point over there, which we've established. It's probably even flatter than that. It's probably more like that. Okay? It'll go across a step like that because, unlike the horizontal casting edge, this vertical casting edge is parallel to the vertical surfaces and perpendicular to the horizontal surfaces. So it climbs the vertical surfaces straight up and then reverts to a flagpole shadow like that, and at some point it'll just intersect this other system. And when it does intersect it, that's the end of it. This is just like a little tongue of sunlight sort of licking up the stairs, and it gets that far, and that's the end of it. But it is being cast by two opposite step systems. The first one is cast by a horizontal casting edge, and it's parallel on the horizontal surfaces, perpendicular on the vertical surfaces. And it just keeps doing that alternating pattern. While the other one is cast by a vertical casting edge, and it's perpendicular on the horizontal surfaces and parallel on the vertical surfaces. So that's what that shadow looks like in detail. And on all this, you would fill in dark shadow. So let's do that back at our full perspective, and we're about finished with this one. Let me keep this other piece of paper under it, reposition it, and do what we just did blown up, only at much smaller scale. They're going to close out about like that. Okay, and then I need to add just a little white to that piece of sunlight that goes back and up the steps. And now I think I have the luxury of adding some things that might just improve the looks. Well, first I could shade that building in the distance, because I know the whole back of it that's turned toward us is going to be in shade. Not this side wall, but the back of it will be. And I know that it'll cast some kind of a shadow on the ground. And I can just put that in quickly without worrying about its accuracy. It's just going to cast a shadow on the ground like that. This is going to cast a shadow on the ground like that. Need to tone that in shade. I'm going to pick up my green Prismacolor pencil and just draw a little landscape surface between the building we're in and the next one to make that horizontal surface lie down and show that there's space between the two buildings. I forgot to tone in this little end. And then I think we ought to take just a minute and review what we did and kind of admire the drawing. You always want to save time to do that. If drawing isn't enjoyable, then it isn't worth doing. And most good delineators I know spend a lot of time just looking at their drawings. It's not always an admiration. It's a habit that you get into looking at the big picture and sort of deciding what you could do in the few remaining minutes to make the perspective better. So I'm going to show you an alternative way of rendering this space that uses indirect light. But I think we're about essentially finished with the drawing, with the shadow casting. Now remember, we get to choose these 2 points, and if you don't like the resulting shadow pattern, you can always change those 2. You can move them off the paper, or you can shorten them, depending on how far you want to let sunlight into the room. There is an alternate way of rendering spaces like this. If for whatever reason you don't have time to cast the shadows in the room, you can render them in indirect light. This is also appropriate for north-facing rooms, where the room actually faces north and would get no direct sunlight. The technique here is to simply make an analysis. We bring in our little analysis cube, and we leave it a solid cube because all we're trying to do is to analyze the light on the 6 surfaces of the cube. And we always assume that the brightest sunlit surface, number 1, is on the surface that is hidden from us, the surfaces that would face the entering light. The darkest surface is always that surface which is turned away from the light. And it's the one that we've been making the darkest. It's the one that's silhouetted against the light. It's the opposite partner of value number 1. So that's the darkest of all the 6 surfaces on the cube. The top is normally the next lightest surface. It's value 2. And that means that value 5 is the underside of the cube. And you say, well, we don't have any of those. Oh, yes, we do. The ceiling is one of those 5. It is the underside of the roof structure. The 3 and 4 are our choices, and they depend on which way you want to assume the light is entering, whether it's off to our right or off to our left. Once you have made this analysis, all you have to do is go back to the perspective and just sort of color by numbers. You render every surface in the room consistent with that light analysis, so that we can see here that the surfaces that are turned toward us, silhouetted against the light, are the darkest in the room. The second darkest are the ceiling surfaces, the bottoms of things. You have to, once again, take the time to color the back of the tracing with white Prismacolor pencil, because that's what heightens the contrast, and that's the initial thing I started to talk about at the beginning of this videotape. The difference between being in an inner, dimly lit volume, looking out at a bright, sunlit space beyond. Okay, now, I would encourage you to always light your interior perspective. If you don't have time to cast the shadows, or you, for whatever reason, don't want to deal with it that day, then render it like this. But give your drawings a sense of light, so they look better to you and will look better to your clients. And whenever you have the time, please master direct shadow casting, because the most dramatic way to light any interior space is to actually bring sunlight into the room, like this. There's nothing that you can do that's more beneficial to your drawings. It's real. It's a real interest category. It's not just cosmetic. The light quality in any space is integral with the design of that space and deserves your knowing how to render it.